Now, here to answer some of your questions, I am joined by Josh Hillman, who is the Director of Education, Alex Beer, who's one of the programme heads in the welfare team, and Ash Patel, who's a programme head in the justice team. So our first question that we're going to kick off with is for Josh. And it's from Diogo Sousa Montero, and Diogo asks, do you only fund research based in the UK, or are other geographies also funded?
Well, the first thing to say about that is we are a UK-based organisation, so we cover all 4 nations of the UK and are interested in comparisons and differences. There's quite significant differences in policy and practice in all of our areas of interest across those countries. That's our primary focus. But we're also interested in what we can learn from practice, policies, experiments and interventions overseas, and what we can bring to the UK-based context from those, and comparisons in terms of performance and different types of policies. So we are UK-focused in terms of where we're interested in having an influence, but we draw from internationally. Although we should add that a lot of our work is providing evidence which can be used overseas by governments and by professional bodies overseas.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I've got a question for you, Ash, now, which is from Natalie Sadaka, who asks, how broadly do you define justice? Is it beyond courts and tribunals? Could it include, for example, examining the operation of labour inspection and enforcement bodies?
So it's a really good question, Natalie. Thank you for that. We take quite a broad definition of justice. So while a lot of the research that we fund does look at the formal justice system, so the courts and tribunals, we're also interested in the less formal side of justice as well. I think the sort of underpinning interest is what people's experience of the justice system is. What do they do when they encounter a problem? What is the awareness that they have of the justice system? So in that sense, we do fund work that is broader than just courts and tribunals and the sort of formal justice system.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
And in sort of areas that sort of cross between the justice and the welfare areas of interest, we're interested in questions like sort of people's access to benefits, and how they might sort of pursue those rights in relation to the benefit system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're really interested in the administrative justice system, so decision making that occurs around people's rights and obligations outside of that formal system.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Next question for you, Alex, if that's okay. So what kind of outputs do we expect? Are non-academic outputs encouraged, such as policy documents, toolkits and reports? And do we expect involvement from non-academic partners in the project design and delivery? And that is from Anna Seislick.
Thank you, Anna. That's a really good question. I'd say our primary focus is on the difference you are trying to make through your project, thinking very, very clearly about who the audiences are that you want to be able to influence. And so there is no sort of one-size-fits-all to the type of outputs that we expect. And whilst we sort of anticipate that you will be producing sort of academic outputs, and we're sort of very interested in the rigour of your analysis, and that is sort of tested and challenged through presenting at academic events, we are really interested in that interface between sort of the learnings from the research and policy and practice. So yes, we're definitely looking at sort of policy-focused documents, these are round table discussions with key sort of policymakers or practitioners, and sort of any other innovative ways to sort of get the message across from your findings, to those people that might be able to sort of make a difference with it.
Many of our projects have multiple outputs aimed at different audiences, so some of them will be particularly aimed at building the research field, so they'll be in peer-reviewed journals, but at the same time all of our projects have at least one output that is fully accessible and readable for that broad audience of policymakers. So many projects have multiple outputs.
Just add one more thing. One of the things that we do emphasise is the communications plan within all of our grants, and we set that out quite early, that each of our grants has a strategic plan around communications. to map who the audiences are, what the messages you want to get across to them, and how you're going to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Next question for you, Josh. Do we fund medical research if it fits the education category? And the example that is given is a population study looking at how prematurity affects numeracy in early years education.
So we wouldn't fund medical research as such. There are many other funders with more significant and resources that are directed towards that. But we're really interested in the impact of health-related issues, and prematurity be an example of that, as an influence on outcomes that we're interested in, whether that's in the education system or in the welfare or in justice. And similarly, we're interested in how those might feed back on each other. So we wouldn't fund traditional medical research, but we're interested in those relationships.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Alex, I'm going to direct this question to you, if that's okay, which is Rebecca Goldman asks, she says that we've been tweeting and blogging this year about specific research interests, such as early years research, cost of living, impact of COVID. And she asks, when assessing outline applications against research relevance, will a project addressing these specific issues score more highly, or are we assessing them only based on the broader research interests outlined in our guide for applicants?
Yeah. So when we're assessing outline applications and even our sort of full applications, we are looking at relevance. We're also looking at sort of the conceptual framework underpinning the proposal. We're looking at the methodological approach, the team, the budget, and also its potential to impact and influence. And so we're looking at an outline application across all of those dimensions. You've mentioned relevance, which is one of the sort of first things we look at, and applications that respond to any of the interests that we've set out in our guide for applicants and in any of our tweets will be scoring very, very highly on relevance. And I mean, I think sort of some of the subjects that we tweet about, be they early years, I've sort of trying to develop Nuffield's portfolio on ageing, for example. I mean, they are going to score very highly on relevance, but anything that is covered in our guide for applicants will be getting a high relevance score.
I mean, it's worth mentioning that many of the themes that we highlight particularly strongly, so recently, obviously, we had a particular call relating to the COVID pandemic, and we've had emphases on cost of living and geographic inequalities. Those are often shining a particularly strong light on issues that we're already dealing with quite in quite fundamental ways in the rest of our work. They're just particularly highlighting those, but they're not actually presenting many new issues for us. It's just a new angle on us, which at any particular point, as Alex says, is making them more relevant to current policy debates.
Brilliant, thank you. And this actually links to a question which has come in for me, which is from Juliet Wilson-Thomas, who asks, are we currently funding research into early years policy? Yeah, absolutely. Early years is one of our biggest areas. It's the area that I look after. And we've recently published a blog about our refreshed research interests in this area. So that's very much something that we are interested in. Okay, so here's a question which I'm just going to ask any of you to take. And I'll read it out, and you can let me know who wants to come back. So it says, the understandable lack of feedback on applications makes it hard to work out where we went wrong when we have applied. What do applicants commonly get wrong, or what features are missing from their projects that Nuffield want to see? Who wants to take that tricky one?
I mean, I'd say the most common thing is possibly trying to do too much in a single project. Quite often, with a view to trying to make a proposal as sort of comprehensive as possible, and also taking the different stages of the sort of research chain. for example, in the development of a new intervention and then evaluating and trialling it at a reasonable level scale. People try to do all of that in one go, or they try to do combine quantitative work, qualitative work, and a literature review before maybe the literature review has highlighted what the quantitative or qualitative work should be, those sorts of things. So I'd say that's probably my number one piece of feedback.
I think I'd second that.
Yeah.
Ash, Alex, anything you want to add on that?
I think one of the other common reasons that we might not carry forward an application is the lack of clarity about the pathway to impact or how it might lead to change, and sort of emphasis on really understanding how doing the research and how that then translated into something that policymakers, practitioners can use is quite often sort of a weakness in applications.
Anything to add on that, Alex?
I think Josh and Ash have covered it.
Brilliant, thank you. Ash, I've got a question for you from Saeed Iqbal, who asks, can you apply to more than one area for funding? So, as well as education, justice and welfare.
Short answer, yes. You can apply discretely to each of our areas, or you can, one of the things that we would like to see is more interdisciplinary work and work that bans all of our, or multiple of our programs. So the only thing I think we would look out for is that you're not necessarily stretching yourself too far. So having 3 applications in at the same time, probably not the most the strategic use of your time. But yeah, short answer.
But yeah, and so sort of just going back to sort of Josh's previous response, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you try and span all 3 of our domains to think that it might lead to a sort of more relevant application, because there's a risk there of you spreading yourself too thinly. And on a very, very practical note, we do ask people when they're submitting their application to tick one of education, welfare, or justice. Now, we're a relatively small team. We work very, very closely together, and ticking that box is just a funnel to decide which team will look at it in the first instance. But where there is a sort of cross-domain interest, we'll be sharing that application amongst the relevant teams. So your application will be likely looked at in the first instance, by people sitting across domains, if there is that cross-domain relevance.
There's some clear areas that absolutely span our areas of interest. So, for example, in youth justice, the trajectories and outcomes for young people who've entered the youth justice system, and how education can provide a route back into potential employment, and that's one area. Or skills development as being at the interface between school and the world of work, as well as another one that spans our education and welfare interests. So there's many, and those are of particular interest to us. We're trying hard to not see these as separate programs, but as being 3 principal areas of interest.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a couple of methodological ones coming up, so I'm going to ask them both and see who wants to take them. The first one is that methodology may not be 100% fixed at the start of a project when it's an explorative multi-stage project. How would you recommend explaining a robust methodology in this case? And that's from Kim Turner, so that's the first methodology one. The second methodology one is, with mixed methodologies that can incorporate can you incorporate creative research methodologies alongside qualitative methods? So who wants to kick us off on those 2 qualitative methodology questions? So the first one was about how we explain a robust methodology when the methodology isn't fixed from the start.
I think we'd want to just have that sort of clear starting position sort of set out, and the process that you are going to take to refine the methodology as the programme of work gets underway, and sort of demonstrate that you've got both the right skills within the team to enable you to adapt accordingly, And often we will also look at the supports, the wider supports you have around the team, for example, through your advisory group setup, that all provide the sort of necessary levels of support and challenge as you try and sort of navigate your way through refining the methodology.
But we've got lots of examples of projects where during the course of the project they've developed new methodological strands, they've encountered new data sets that can be brought to bear. Through the process of doing the analysis, they've had new ideas of ways of addressing the research questions. So there is some flexibility, and we're very open to that. We recognise that at the point at which people apply, they might not have had full sight of the potential of the data to do these sorts of analyses. So there is some flexibility there.
Brilliant, thank you. Just got a couple more methodological questions coming up, so I'm going to get those in as quickly as we can. Josh, one for you about RCTs. Simona Tenaglia asks, are RCTs financed?
We do fund RCTs. In fact, some of our most successful projects have been randomised controlled trials. Particularly in our education area, it's been one of our sort of our strengths in that area. Not large-scale RCTs, I should mention, because the size of our funding just doesn't allow for that. But modestly sized RCTs that can then be scaled up and funded by organisations like the Education Endowment Foundation, who have taken on projects that we've shown promise from smaller scale RCTs with great success. But we recognise and value RCTs as a methodology, and we think it's important in all of our areas.
Thank you very much. And just related to that, do we fund secondary data analysis and evidence reviews, or just primary research? Again,
many of our projects undertake secondary data analyses. We're particularly interested in the use of large-scale administrative data sets. We're interested in analyses that use the big birth cohort studies and those that link all of those sorts of data sets. So a big chunk of our funding goes to secondary data analysis, and I think you mentioned evidence reviews as well. We don't think there's enough existing literature reviews or evidence reviews of what's already there. It's something that other funders don't fund enough of, and we would like to do more of that. But I would say, just as a point for our viewers, that we don't see that many applications that are just looking at review of new evidence, because there's a lot of incentives, particularly in the university sector, to be continually doing new research rather than taking stock of the evidence that's already there.
Thank you. So from methodologies onto topics, and this one's for you. Go on.
Capture all of the methodology questions. I think there was a
the creative methodology
one.
Oh yes. Yes. Who wants to take that one, or would you like a reminder of what that was? Do you want to?
Sorry.
Yes, of course, absolutely. So the question was, with mixed methodologies, can you include the incorporation of creative research methodologies alongside qualitative methods?
Yes. I think our overarching approach is we're really interested in understanding methodologies that match the research question. So as long as there's a methodological need for it, and this is where the conceptual framework of the research comes into play, we would certainly consider that. I suppose this does link to that initial question about methodology, about how tightly defined methods need to be and methodology needs to be from the outset. And I think this is where we would need to look at if you can't provide the necessary detail of the methods specifically, having the right infrastructure and framework for the delivery of research.
Brilliant, thank you. I've just got a couple of questions about topics now. So we've only got a few minutes left. So Ash, one for you. Under the justice category, would research looking at how the judicial and legal reform influences people's lives be appropriate?
Yes. Again, one of our sort of priority areas is we understand that the justice system is under a current reform programme, and we're really interested in understanding what that actually means for the people that are going through and using the system. So, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And a topic one for you, Alex. Is the Nuffield Foundation interested in funding research in the area of climate change and the transition to net zero? And that is from Ellen Killick.
Thank you, Ellen. Yes, we are. We're particularly interested in the impact of climate change and the transition to net zero on the lives of individuals and their well-being, and also on community well-being. Which individuals and communities might be most vulnerable to the climate crisis, to the transition, and what are the mitigations that you might have in place to sort of reduce the risks that those vulnerable individuals face. We've got a couple of grants that are looking at the transition to net zero at the moment, but yeah, this is certainly an area in which we're keen to fund.
And just to butt in there, I would note that we haven't actually funded any area in terms of any projects in relation to climate change and education, but we would be interested in what the implications are for the education system and the extent to which the curriculum is fit for purpose in preparing young people for the effects of climate change. So that's just something that we're thinking about longer term and would be interested in people's ideas and projects around.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We've only got a minute left, so time for maybe one or possibly two quick questions. This one can go to anyone. What are your expectations in terms of the impact and applicability of research outputs? Who wants to take that one?
So I think the key thing is that you have thought realistically about the opportunities for influence or for impact. We are not when we talk about impact, we're not necessarily expecting to see immediate policy or practice change. I mean, you might be contributing to sort of improving understanding, sort of widening the knowledge base, sort of creating the conditions for change at some point in the future. So, I mean, just be sort of realistic about your ambitions there, but have thought about that pathway sort of to change, to potential change.
I mean, many of the areas where we've had most influence as a funder, and the work that we've funded has had influence, have been very slow burn over a period of, often over a period of 10 years, 15 years, have filtered through into research and policy thinking, and nothing has changed. Very few things have changed overnight as a result of the research that we funded. So we recognise that influence is a very slow process in the areas that we're interested in. So we're patient as a funder.
Brilliant, and thank you very much. On that note, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you so much for everyone, for all of your questions. We haven't in any way had a chance to get through them all. So what we're going to do is pull lots of your questions together and put a frequently asked questions sheet up on our website. And if you've got a burning question that you've not yet had a chance to answer, please do email us. Our email address is in the chat box. We very much look forward to hearing from you. Please do send us in your feedback, but more importantly, we'd love to hear from you if you've got a great idea for a research project that fits into some of the areas that we've just been talking about today. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us today.